my journey, well, really any journey, but my journey and my path towards being an Olympic athlete is truly marked and consumed with love and heartbreak. But I figured out pretty early on in my journey that in order for me to really love myself, I would need to constantly fight for myself, vouch for myself, stand up for myself, speak up for myself. And this was proved true the first day of my wrestling practice. I wrestled in high school. I was dared to join the team. And that first day, I was tested, and my instincts, my intuition, but really my entire journey moving forward was tested. I walked into the room. It was the first day of the season, and I got there early because I was nervous, and I had no background to wrestling, like true wrestling. And no, none of the other athletes were there. The coach was sitting in his office in one of those old school, where the glass is separating his office from the training area. And so he was there, but like siphoned off from me. And I saw him, and I kind of looked around, and I took it all in, and he looked up and glanced at me and paused, got up, walked to his closet and grabbed something from it and walked over towards me and handed me a mop. And he thought that I was the team manager. He thought that I was there to clean him up after the actual team. And I remember holding the mop that he just handed me, and he walked away immediately, and this is just my moment. And I remember thinking, like, the universe just gave me an absolute out. I could actually never do this, and it would be totally fine. This is a legitimate reason. But I also realized that it was a test for me, at least. I could either do that and I could become the team manager, or I could see this dare through and last on this wrestling team for 2 hours back in 2003, which, well, it was technically 2002, which I did. Growing up, I wasn't super talented, and I wasn't just involved in sports, though. I was very talented in a lot of things. I was in, I think, 3 choirs in high school. I was on the dance team. I was in multiple sports. I was in student government. And I just really I really was like, if I'm good at something, I'm going to find a club to be a part of, because I desperately sought out escapism. Before that was even a term that I was introduced to, I was always looking for things to do and things to keep me distracted, and really things to keep me outside of my house, because I was constantly escaping home. I was very competitive. I was very ambitious, but the fact is I had some heartbreak going at home that I was seeking an escape from. And as I mentioned, I wasn't particularly talented, but I realized very early on in those first few weeks of wrestling on this all men's team, I realized this is a sport that you can work really hard at. And if you have the right people around you, you can be really successful. And I was definitely one of those people that I was looking for that key, that golden ticket out. And so I applied this thinking, not only to wrestling, which is truly what got me to this place of really like trusting myself, but I applied it to everything. And because of that, I was able to wrestle for Arizona State University. I became the first female to join their roster back in 2007, 13th in the US. And I made choices that would feed this dream, this ticket. I never partied. I never drank. I was very involved in my ministry. I lived a very good life, and I lived a very straight edge life, and I did the right things. I was particular about who I hung out with. Everything I did with my time was thoughtful and intentional. And this was before these types of things were discussed in mainstream. This was just my instincts telling me, you need to be very wary of the time that you spend and who you spend it with. And again, with this thinking, I ended up moving to Colorado. I uprooted my whole life. I put everything on hold. I finished my undergrad online. I moved to Colorado and I trained full time for the Olympics. And it did eventually pay off. I had success in wrestling. I very intentionally improved in the sport. I was moving my way up in the rankings. And 3 years later, 3 years after I moved, I ended up making the Olympic team. And that's the goal, right? It's the first goal. I was still a pretty young athlete when I did make the team and when I moved to the training center. By the time that I did move to the Olympic Training Center in Colorado, I had been on the national team for 3 years. So even though I hadn't been around these high-level athletes for a long time, I had put my body through hell. I noticed pain in my collarbone. And as a combat athlete, that's just something you notice. And I've done a lot of things, and high-level athletes will tell you there's injuries and then there's being hurt. And sometimes it's hard to distinguish between the two. But I knew pretty early on that this wasn't something that I could just tough out. I couldn't just work my way through. So I brought it to my sports med team, and these were also people that I had worked with day in and day out. I consider them part of my coaching staff. They were part of my circle. And I brought this to them, and at this point, it's hard to drive. I can't even steer my wheel without my collarbone hurting. I can't put on a shirt without it popping out. I literally can't even put my hair in a ponytail. I remember one of my friends putting my hair up, and it was in the same ponytail, started here, and then it ended up here after a few days because I couldn't fix it. I couldn't lift my arm. So it wasn't just competing. Of course it's competing. That's what puts food on my table. But every single day I was in pain. And the response to me was, well, let's do rehab. Let's strengthen the muscles. And I trusted this team, but my instincts were telling me it demanded something more. And I didn't have proof that it demanded more. I just felt it and believed it. So there was a lot of butting heads. I ended up competing at the Olympics, and we were able to manage the pain. There's definitely ways to do that. So I was able to compete, but it was heartbreaking for me because I wasn't competing at 100%. And when you have an opportunity like this, you want to be your best self, and I wasn't. But I pursued and I persevered with my sports med team, and after months of really butting heads and a lot of lifestyle pain and just quality of life, and just seeing this what started as a little injury become something that like I couldn't even go through a morning routine without acknowledging, I realized I needed to venture out, and I needed to probably go against the input that I had received. And by chance, I came across a surgeon in New York. He did treatment out of the best hospital in New York. And he worked with a lot of high-level athletes in the US. And I had a consult with him. I was on a speaking tour, and I was able to go see him. And I remember sitting there, and I was pretty depleted because at this point, I had just been told day in and day out before, during, and after the Olympics that we don't have an answer for you. Just do rehab, which I did not believe was an answer. And I remember sitting there with him, telling him all this, and he just looked at me matter-of-factly. With his experience, with his expertise, he was so certain when he said, I think we can get you back to 98%. And I remember getting emotional because I'm just like, for months now, like, people have told me that I just need to tough this out. And you kind of feel like, am I not tough enough? Your whole career rests on you being tough and pushing through and finding a way. but I felt like I couldn't find a way. This is beyond finding a way. And he took his expertise and he matched it with my instincts. And he told me he could heal me. And I hadn't heard that in so long. And to even pursue this dream, you have to be healthy. You can't even really do this unless you have a baseline of health. And it meant everything to me. And I just remember it pulled at my heart, and I was so emotional. And I was like, it's been so long since someone was just like, I can help you. And it meant the world to me. So I ended up getting the surgery, which was against the advice of maybe like 5 or 6 medical professionals that I had worked with, like I said, every day for a few years now. And it caused some pushback. You know, I would go in for rehab back home, and my physical therapist would show up 45 minutes late if they showed up at all. Sometimes I would go in just to get their opinion, and they would literally ignore. I mean, I remember being ignored, and other physicians were watching my physician ignore me. I remember these things happening. And I just realized that you can be the best in the world, and you're going to go through those lows, and people are still people. And that when you decide to choose your own path, which is what I literally had to do, because in my mind, I was like, if I don't heal this, there is no career. There's no Kelsey Campbell wrestling. I knew day in and day out in my training that if I didn't find a solution to this would all be over. It was a risk I was willing to take, but because I was willing to take the risk, my team felt offended and didn't want to be a part of it. And it was a big lesson for me. It was a big lesson for me in my whole career, because I had many years after that. When you choose your path, when you choose to trust yourself, you're going to lose people. There's no way around that. You will lose people, and you have to choose to trust your path. And you know, the Olympics, obviously that's a big stage, and a lot of times we learn these lessons in big moments on big stages with a lot of consequences. But you know, I had other moments throughout my journey as an athlete where I made a decision and I chose my instincts and I chose for myself, and I was right. And I was able to give myself a pat on the back, and I was able to move forward and feel good about it. But there have been times where I was not a part of the popular vote, and I still had to trust what I felt, and I still had to trust what I believed. And that's truly, for me, was the biggest lesson through these things, is that the love, the heartbreak, truly, I'm grateful for the confidence that I received and the freedom that leaning into my own self-love, my own heartbreaks, leaning into my intuition is really what has given me the strength to be the best version of me. And that's really been the journey for me. And that's really been what I've loved most about my experience.